Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Chandran Nair. Chandran is a Malaysian citizen but has been based on Hong Kong for over 25 years and has extensively traveled in China. He is also the founder of Global Institute for Tomorrow and a leading thinker on sustainability, global governance, and the limits of Western development models. He is the author of The Sustainable State and a prominent voice arguing that Asian nations must chart their own path by prioritizing social well-being and ecological limits over Western-style consumption-driven growth. Chandran has just co-published his book Understanding China, Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence. And today we are going to discuss his books largely in the context of understanding China. Chandran, welcome to India and Global Left.
Jyotish, thank you for having me. Real honor and privilege. Thank you.
I think maybe a good way to start is to hear from you a little bit about why did you write the book Understanding China at this moment. We have been discussing China in the context of rising economic warfares, discussion about Chinese economic miracle, challenges China has been facing internally and so on and so forth. I'm curious about your thoughts on what went into writing this book.
Thank you very much, Jyotish, for having me. And that question is perhaps a good place to start. Like many people who have an interest in geopolitics, I've been following, though I'm not a geopolitical expert as such, but interested in development, lived in Africa, etc. When I came to Hong Kong about more than 25 years ago, I went to a China that's very different from today. And I've been following that, observing. But at the same time, people like us read the international mainstream media, which is a whole different topic about why we get all our information from those sources. But I like to think I've freed myself of that ailment now, and so we have more diverse. But it's part of the education, our colonial upbringing, etc. So what was very interesting to me, particularly going back about 10 years, was what I was seeing in China and what I was reading in the newspapers, particularly the mainstream media. And having put a lot of faith in this concept of, the liberal media essentially being honest, that it's journalists were there to report on the facts, and this idea that journalism is supposed to inform us, I came to the conclusion there was something so disconnected between what I was seeing and what was being reported, and being on the front line both in Hong Kong, etc. And so I started to question this. But the realization was that people like me had been indoctrinated too in believing that whatever I read in the mainstream Western media must be true, or whatever I heard on BBC, CNN, CNBC must be true. And once I shifted that and began to look, and then, of course, ground truth, what I was seeing, it became very clear to me that there was a concerted effort to, not describe China, and there are many other countries in the world, but because I'm close to China and China was being demonized, that there was a need, that there was something going on. So I started to write a few articles about questions like articles that said, China can't be all bad. There must be some good things about it. Can we hear about it? Things like that, and gave examples. So over time, and then about 2-3 years ago, I'm a member of the Club of Rome. And for those of you who don't know, it's an old established think tank. And a few of us who are more sympathetic to a more multipolar world and a more nuanced understanding of what's going on rather than the sort of polarized geopolitical Cold War stance, formed the Club of Rome China. And we decided that one of our missions would be to explain China. And I took on the task of writing that first book, given that I'd already become immersed as a non-Chinese person, but living in China in this very strange sort of view of me being in China, seeing certain things, non-Chinese, and then reading all of this in my so-called favorite international magazines or newspapers and seeing it very differently. So I thought, and in the last, we wrote that book with the Club of Rome, but in the last 18 months decided that we should get an international publication to publish it because it's so important that people understand. And may I just conclude that response to your comment by saying that, most books look to criticize or praise. There is the anti-China, and then there's the sort of pro-Beijing camp. This book seeks to do neither. What it does is it does not seek to criticize, and there's tons of stuff every day. You can open the newspaper today and read that the fire in Hong Kong, the catastrophic fire, is apparently the fault of China. So because it doesn't criticize, some will see it as pro-China. That is to miss the point. The book lays out the facts, the issues, and observations as well from people, from me and others, the members of the Club of Rome China, and allowing the reader to decide. It does not tell you or seek to persuade you to like or dislike China. It persuades you to look, examine the facts, and analyze the data and come to your own conclusions. So the hope is that people will better understand China, from whatever perspective, but come to the conclusion that, there's much more nuances to the understanding of China than is in the mainstream media, and appreciate that most of what people hear about China, sadly, in the mainstream media is not balanced, and we try to provide a balanced view of China. So that's the genesis of the book.
Talking about mainstream media propaganda about China and also fact, two of the things you just said, I wanted to pick up on a data point that you have mentioned in your book, which is almost 3.4% out of 4 sees the central government in China favorably. And when it comes to local governments, the numbers are very close to 3, 2.8, 2.9 to 3. And the Western mainstream media has tried to frame the narrative about Chinese political system as authoritarian, totalitarian, as if there is no legitimacy, while the numbers say quite the contrary. So if you could tell our viewers, how would you explain this incredible legitimacy of the Chinese government among its citizens, particularly at a time globally when government legitimacy in the West in particular, but also across much of a large chunk of the global South, government legitimacy hasn't been that high?
Yeah, no, very, very, very important point. But let me just focus on the point you make about legitimacy, right? So, what is legitimacy? In the Western sort of neoliberal discourse, legitimacy is, we have a democratic process, someone gets elected or the party, and therefore they are legitimate. So, if you look at the United States today, there's a lot of people who don't like the policies of the current administration, but they would argue that the current administration is legitimate. In Europe, as I think the point you were making was that they are not popular, but they would argue we are legitimate. So if you look in the UK, I don't know how many prime ministers they've had in the last 5 years. I've lost count. But the current incumbent of Downing Street is extremely unpopular and seems to be losing, popularity in the polls. But he is legitimate in terms of the political process. So in the Chinese context, I don't think the question is one of legitimacy. It is essentially one of delivering on promise and delivering on improving quality of life, security, and allowing people to understand the complexities of the country they live in. And that then gives rise to the sort of support that you have, the numbers, 3 out of 4, etc. I mean, I think there's surveys done independently by international organizations which have shown that if there were elections, the Chinese Communist Party would win hands down. You could argue there's not enough opposition, and that is correct, but that is not the way to look at the Chinese system. But they are extremely popular. So, to paraphrase you in terms of the legitimacy in terms of results. And the point I try and make is, and this is also the sort of basis by which Singapore initially was highly criticized, particularly Lee Kuan Yew, for being a dictator going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But he did have legitimacy in terms of he did have an election process. It was considered because he was uncompromising in his commitment to developing the country. Then he was accused of being a dictator. And then further arguments that the opposition is weak and all of that. The Chinese system, though, in terms of legitimacy, is rooted in delivery of results and communitarian sort of commitment to results. If that starts to fail, the population begins to express its displeasure in ways that are not well understood or, in fact, even acknowledged by mainstream Western media, because in their view, there should be a revolution and everything should be burned down and a new system put in place. But that's not how that system works, and it's never worked that way, except when in previous eras there were sort of upheavals which were triggered by a whole host of other things. So the point of legitimacy or acceptance or support of the government in China by the majority of people is because their lives have improved remarkably in the last 30, 40 years. And the other point I would say, Chinese also understand their country and history. They know what happened and they treasure peace, and they know that to disrupt what is on balance, a good system that has worked for them. Not perfect. They all understand there are people who are critical of the system. They all don't turn up in jail, by the way, as is simplified. I have been to village meetings where they're hugely critical of the government. They're critical of the party head, etc., and ask for changes. But they understand that chaos is not what they want. So work within the system, and that's also civilizational understanding of the system. And I'll also say one more thing: deep rooted in that Chinese political economy and civilizational approach to governance is the issue of meritocracy, which is a cultural feature. And we at the Global Institute tomorrow, we've actually had a webinar recently about this, that a cultural feature of the political economy is actually the question of meritocracy, which goes back 2,000 years. So you have to prove you're good enough. And if you go to most places in China, and I'm sure you have, Jyotish, that you can go to small towns that most people have never heard of, populations of 2 to 3 million. You can meet the mayor and the vice mayor, and they will be in their mid-40s with double degrees, highly competent, highly educated, and not just card-carrying members of a defunct political system. And they have to prove themselves every day of the week with KPIs as well.
That's a good point to discuss a question that I had for you about the Chinese bureaucracy itself. There has been a lot internally and externally about the efficiency of the Chinese bureaucracy. We have seen huge anti-corruption drive within China to root out some of the inefficiencies. And much of that has been very popular, particularly among people who are relatively poorer. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on what has made the Chinese bureaucracy relatively more efficient than what we have seen elsewhere, particularly in the context of adapting with the market reforms, its relationship with the business class while delivering on the social promises that is very critical to the bureaucracy. I think that would be clarifying for much of our viewers?
That's a good question. I think to understand that, one needs to go back to the fact that what I mentioned, that meritocracy and hard work is valued and respected in China, right? That doesn't mean I'm saying that there aren't people who break the rules or like any society. But at a governance system, the legitimacy, as you said, of any institution, be it the village at level or the town level or provincial level, is very much linked to, have you performed? Have you done what you're supposed to do? And for that, then linked to that is, well, can you do the job? Are you qualified? You're not just some elected person who just comes in and says, well, I think I can do the job. And we all seen in the United States people who are elected, very populous, etc., but questionable whether they were suited to actually be a president of a country, particularly one with such a global impacts in terms of internal politics resulting in decisions that could affect people around the world. So the Chinese system respects and values hard work, and at the government side, a commitment to society and the community, and very importantly, do you have the capabilities to do the work? And I think what happened over the last 20 years, or even going back a bit, I mean, the early years was a struggle with all all the reform and entering the market economy, etc. But I think factors for the rise of China are not just economic. There are many factors, and I'll just outline a couple of them. But then were fundamentally understood to be wholly dependent on the capacity at each level to trickle down the competence. And I talk about this in my book on the sustainable state, that, who cares what you call it, but you need to have competence, and you need to have that capability built through. So I think the factors for China's rise, I think many might know, but just to cite a couple of things, the reform started by saying productivity should be the center of economic reforms, right? So productivity-centered economic reforms. Then they understood to have that, you need to have intense investment in infrastructure. And you can't do that if you don't have very competent institutions and leaders to do that at every level. And then a very deep understanding going back 20, 30 years ago on strategic and intense technical research, which built competency at a technical level, but also at an administrative level, because in a large country like that, you need both to complement. This then gave rise into coming back into the institutions of learning, hundreds of thousands of highly competent, confident, and hardworking bureaucrats to come in the system. And very distinctively, the commitment to the community, the communitarian sort of spirit embedded within the civilization as well. The highest compliment you can give a Chinese person, I think, is that they serve the society, a sort of collective civil society approach to your work. And then I think the other part of it is the commitment to long-term political planning. I don't need to tell you, you can't compare what is happening in the United States, where there's the concept of long-term has gone because of the vested interests of short-term political interests. So long-term political planning allows you to invest in building all of these things and nurturing hundreds of thousands of extremely capable civil servants. And serving through society, through the civil service, is seen as an extremely noble profession as well in China. So those are the things that I would say, help to develop this whole sort of competency, meritocracy, and outcome-driven sort of professionals that serve inside the Chinese government. That doesn't mean there aren't corrupt officials, there aren't incompetent ones, but as you have seen and heard, there has been a complete commitment to weeding out incompetence and corruption. It's not like in every country of the world. It still persists in pockets. But I can say from my own experience, and I can give many anecdotes, which we don't have time for, it has reached even the most rural areas of China that the fight against corruption and incompetence in terms of public administration.
Uh, you have also discussed about civil society briefly in your book. You raised this question that a lot of Western narrative about China is that it lacks civil society. Um, of course, at one level, it's a misunderstanding about civil society necessarily have to be completely independent of the state. And that means any efforts on part of civil society in collaboration with state official would not be deemed as authentic civil society. And I found your discussion about environmentalism, gender and sexual liberation, particularly in Sichuan, but also elsewhere, and individualism, very striking in the context of your discussion about Chinese civil society. So, if you could lay out a picture of what is the correct framework of looking at Chinese civil society, that would be helpful.
I think civil society, yeah. And I just wanted to start with something you just said about, people's a form of expression, etc. If you follow some stuff on social media in China, WeChat, TikTok, and other stuff that goes on, some of the most interesting, outrageous fashion in the world I've seen is in China. I mean, the expression, right? It's so it's not about nudity. It's not about showing your butt, but it is full forms of expression. And I encourage anyone who's interested in fashion to go and see what's happening, even in small towns, how people express themselves, and at the same time embracing the historic context and where they live, etc. It's a bit like when we used to see, for those who are interested, outrageous fashion coming out of Japan in the 80s and the 90s. Some of the coolest stuff. I would say today some of the coolest stuff you can find in terms of that form of expression is actually happening in China. Now, in terms of civil society, as you rightly pointed out, we're all steeped in that Western canon of thought about what is civil society, etc. But in China, such a large country, the government seeks to essentially leverage the civil society, and civil society seeks to leverage the government because it's so large, and cities are big, but villages, etc., so remote. So it's actually not in the sort of mindset, and this is a big trap that sadly many Western commentators and civil society groups in the West, they expect other societies to have the same sort of organizing principles as they have. I hate to say it, but it's a height of arrogance. Other societies do organize differently. And a cooperative approach, in my view, and I think you will agree, in our countries in the world where, you light a fire, it can go out of control. And we've seen this in the so-called Arab Springs, etc., where, couch revolutionaries sitting in rich countries were urging people to go out in the streets, and the consequences were dire. I think the Chinese understand that, both the civil society side and the government. So they kind of work together. The Chinese are also extremely well aware, and modern history is littered with civil society groups from the West, many of whom I admire, by the way, but have also been used by the governments to infiltrate and create social unrest. I know the Indian government is extremely sensitive about these issues, etc. So in China, the whole point is to work together. I know a member of a civil society group, a large one on the environment and biodiversity in China. There's full support of the government and was the first to go out and sue and put test cases in court against large Chinese companies going back 20 years, which were polluting the environment. I know another one that was set up the first, independent and supported by the government, but they did it independently to start monitoring air pollution around cities. And going back 20 years with the rudimentary technology we had then, which enabled the government then to learn from them about remote sensing and how to do all of this and actually get the public engaged. And today, that civil society group is extremely well known. The founder is extremely well respected. And so that's how it works in China. I think, again, if I put on my sort of Western liberal hat training, then I would say that what the Chinese government doesn't tolerate is where you see civil society simply as a mechanism for protest and advocacy against things you don't like, which in certain societies clearly there is room for. In other societies, it can be exploited, and the Chinese government does not permit that. Does it sit comfortably with everyone? No. But the majority of Chinese take it as the balance that they have to live with and then use the system effectively to bring about change. And, let's be very clear that it's now widely acknowledged that environmental improvements in China are amongst the most rapid that any country has achieved in 20 years. And it is naive to think that the Chinese government did this all by itself. No, it did not. It did it with civil society. But civil society, and I talk about this in my book on the sustainable state, is not organized groups necessarily. There are movements of people. And I know small towns, particularly in the Sichuan area, in the Tibetan highlands, etc., which are terribly messy, unhygienic, etc., just 15 years ago. Today, there are toilets everywhere. The surface waters are all clean. There's no rubbish. There's hundreds of thousands of trees have been planted. And these were not done by PLA soldiers and Beijing sending workers to these places. These were done by even the monasteries, the temples, and society coming together, but supported by government. So the achievements that China is, often in terms of the environment, renewable energy, etc., have been praised for. Civil society in China, not defined through the classical Western lens, have been instrumental in that. But not all of them can be happy because, if you're drawn to civil society, you're drawn because you have such high expectations, and so people try and work together. So that I hope that answers your question, how it works.
In environment in particular, the Chinese government's efforts to disseminate the idea that there is a global, not just national, but a global responsibility, ecological on emissions and so on and so forth, has helped civil society actually to deepen every efforts like community development through afforestation, but also bringing in business leader in investing in carbon emission reduction technology, etc., etc. I am curious what your thoughts are about NGOs as part of civil societies. Given on one hand, we have seen enormous expansion of NGOs in China from, let's say, the 1990s, and the government does work at the local level. In particular, it works very closely with many of these NGOs in gender liberation, in environment, etc. On the other hand, globally, we have seen NGOs being used as Western front organizations to prop up color revolutions. In cities like Beijing, you find hawkish officials who would deem every efforts at, let's say, LGBTQ plus activists as a proxy of Western organizations, which is, of course, not true. Uh,
Yes.
Given this, how do you look at how the Chinese party state has managed to harness the important energy of NGOs while also pushing back against Western front organizations?
I think this is where the system in China has been put in place, that those who are, you know, are drawn to those issues and causes and are activists are well steeped in understanding the boundaries. Now, the mainstream media would then say, "Oh, they're scared." No, they're respectful of their boundaries, right? And they understand those boundaries can shift over time. And many have shifted because they've proactively worked with the government. I mean, Jyotish, you're from India. I mean, India has probably got the largest amount of NGOs per square inch in the world, right? Extremely committed, good people working tirelessly for the public and common good. Um, but India hasn't achieved as much, and partly not because the government's negligent, but they found the formula for their country, given the political cycles. You know, you get one come in and they don't like this sort of subject matter, etc. So, you know, you mentioned LGBTQ. I mean, there's an active LGBTQ community in all countries, all cities in China. But the Chinese don't want others coming and saying, to politically activate it. It's a bit like, they say there's religious suppression in China. Uh, I've been to parts of China. I come from Malaysia, as you said, and I tell my Malaysian friends there are places in Gansu where I've traveled, and in 1 hour I've seen more masjids and mosques than I've seen in all of Malaysia. But the Chinese system, whether you like it or not, and I think most people agree, says you can pray, you can do all your beliefs, but please don't bring political religion onto the public space. That's their rule. None, right? And I've sent, people, friends I know, videos of the breaking of fast in major Chinese cities in mosques, and they've been shocked at the scale of all of this. So I think this is important to understand. They understand the boundaries and then they work together. The most successful NGOs that I know, and I've worked with NGOs around the world, I found Chinese NGOs gained much more success than NGOs in other countries. In my own country, the major conservation issue now is how do we save the tiger? And India has been huge success, as you know, in saving the tiger. Why? Civil society, rural communities, and the government worked, and there they found a formula. It's a massive success story around the world. You know that better than I do. My country is not working because the NGOs are small, they are disparate, and where some international NGOs have come about, they have used tactics which I kind of agree, they're vocal about it. But what does it do? It puts off our government people, and therefore it doesn't work. But in China, particularly in terms of biodiversity, and in the more highland areas, as you know, the grasslands and the mountainous areas, the efforts of some of the NGOs have been incredibly successful, particularly in efforts to save the snow leopard and some of the grassland or and fauna, and even some of the flora. And there the NGOs have worked because they're such vast areas with government support, with the local indigenous communities, some of the nomadic communities amongst the Tibetans, etc., and got results. And for me, the realization was that the scale of the effort needed, you cannot just be, shouting and advocating for change. You have to work with a partner. And if you can find the key to work with the government, then you get your objectives because those are aligned. So, as I said, coming back to the LGBTQ issue, I've gone to some crazy uh, clubs in Beijing and Shanghai where it's all in the open. But as far as Chinese officials, I can see, it's not politics. It's fine. But when it's used by the media to criticize China, then rightly or wrongly, the Chinese response sometimes seems to be something that adds more fuel to the fire, if I can put it that way, right? But and it's a bit like India, right? More conservative Indians don't want you to talk about the subject, right? The conservative view, but the Western media can make it out to be that, oh my God, everyone's oppressed. Clearly, some people are under lots of pressure not to come out, which is not good, right? I mean, but to then distort it, I don't think serves either side the issue, nor the people who feel they are being ill-treated or not allowed to openly express their views or preferences.
Let's shift the conversation a little bit about the economic success China has had, because much of what we've been talking about regarding popularity or legitimacy, as you would like to, either way you'd like to see it, has been centered around delivering economic success, particularly in the post-reform years. And a lot of things come to mind thinking about Chinese economic success, from very careful and strategic introduction of private players and market elements into the erstwhile socialist economies, to the role of decentralization, by which I mean local governments having enormous responsibility to mobilize resources, and lately infrastructure investment, also enormous investment, both of private and public, in labor and technology. But if you could give us a, let's not say concise, but if you can give us a sort of framework or picture to understand the economic success, how would you conceptualize it?
Yeah, so I'd first qualify any response I provide that it's my lived experience, if you can call it, of going to China when it was very poor. The first time I went to Beijing, there were no new cars. Most people were on bicycles, and everyone was wearing a mouse suit. And I stayed at the Beijing Hotel, which is in Tiananmen Square. And you didn't get a key to your door; someone opened the door for you, etc. So it's very poor. So my experiences from that, I like to think I'm pretty well versed now with the sort of economic sort of fundamentals, and I have a different point of view from the mainstream sort of liberal economic free market theories, etc., which most people I think now understand too, that there are different formulas for different countries. My main take would be that what opened up the country really and created that jump was essentially a very strong sort of uh, substantive public spending, right? Which was steeped in sort of monetary policy that was that not dependent on essentially just foreign direct investment, because China is very big. So substantive public spending. And that started, at least in my observation, by making sure that the large cities began to operate in ways where economic productivity would be unleashed. If you want people to work hard, and you want people to unleash the potential, and you want factories and means of production to improve, you're going to have to spend in public. You have to have substantial public spending. What also happened was, of course, China welcomed the world. And I know that the more conservative Americans tend to think that they did China a favor. One could argue it was the other way around too, right? But China embraced the world. But very importantly, with all of this was it then understood and embedded the integration of the global supply chains into the Chinese economy. It didn't just go and do its own thing, it understood how the world worked. It took a fair bit of time, but it was quicker than most in understanding. And it understood its competitive advantage, which is scale and cheap labor, etc. So that was very important. And then it also sort of started to develop very strong links with, and later on, with having a presence in many developing countries and getting involved in the Belt and Road was also part of all of that. And institutional reforms were central. So in the early days, it was the institutional reforms of the SOE. So I think the economic transformation in China was state-led because at that early stage you needed that vision long term. But then the Chinese system essentially cascaded it through, and at the provincial levels, it was not dictated by Beijing saying you should build this road and you should do this. There was almost competition between the provinces, both for state support, and then that trickled down to the municipalities and towns. So sort of liberating everything. The other thing I would say, and particularly with regard to then the technological sort of burst that also propelled us, was the Chinese ability to embrace new things. They didn't just close it down. And I was speaking to a well-known China, one of the leading Chinese commentators, just a month ago, about what will China do to rein in the potential threat of AI. Because all of us are scared about what might happen despite its power. But we all, if we are honest, know it carries huge risk. And I think, as you know, many of the founding fathers and mothers of AI are warning governments, but no one's taking heed. And so I asked him, and he said, "Oh, we are extremely aware of the threats." But he said, "Our approach is not to shut it down. Our approach is to embrace and see where it goes. But at the same time, we have enough checks and balances in the system that the entrepreneurs, the people who are at the forefront of technology, know what the limits are." And this I found very interesting. They know if they go too far and breach and test the system, they will feel the sort of repercussions of the state. That I thought was very interesting. But it's also interesting to me that about 6 months ago, I was invited to a one-day closed-door work conference of some of the leading tech companies in China. It was all in Chinese. I think I was one of three foreigners there and had a translator in front of me. I was really interested in how they spoke about technology, but not simply from the point of view of profit making. Yeah, you live in the United States. If you went to the US, the discussion is very much about valuations and this and that, and which VC. There was no talk about it taking money. It was the application of AI to complex problems. I thought that was very interesting. And the complex problems were typically about application to industry issues, improving the way people could work, but it was also not about displacing people. That was interesting. So I asked the question, as the person who was there to say, but surely you know that the whole point of all of this technology is to displace people, because otherwise the productivity gains are not there. And then the counter argument is that new jobs will be created because new industries. And what was so interesting to me, a panel of five sort of leading experts in this was so honest about the challenge that I had suggested. And they were willing, they talked about it and said, this is a real problem for society too. So I think this is where on the openness. But to your point, I think the main thing that triggered this is long-term planning, no short-term political cycles. I know of a railway system that's being built at the moment through Central Asia, and it's taking sections of it built, connected major towns, but it's a 15-year project, and the last bit is now being done. So it's long term, it's substantial investments, mobilizing across the country and integrating with global supply chains as well. But can I just add one more point? There's also a big focus on looking at education as a means to build a new category of people. And many of the new AI firms in China, many of the startups and founders were not educated in the US, they were all educated in China as well.
China's educational expenditure, particularly in higher education, shot up dramatically in the 1990s. And this is one of the divergences, if you like, between India and China because of our historical neglect of primary and secondary. In the 90s, when educational expenditure started rising, we had to catch up a lot on the primary and secondary. And so on the higher education spending, it kind of stagnated. So in R&D, in higher education at the time when China was spending a lot in the 90s and the early 2000s, India had all stagnated. I mean, there are other reasons about it because of the high-tech service and manufacturing, because manufacturing tends to have more diffusion with R&D as opposed to clustered concentrated service sector that we had in India, which had very little incentive to spread higher education beyond what the state sector had already ensured for them as captive cheaply subsidized educated class. I think I'm curious to know hear you about the public sector in China, given you said about the state capacity. And it's important to note to our viewers that if one looks at the budgetary deficit in China, it's very constrained. I mean, it looks like a typical neoclassical state. It's the more extra budgetary side within the local government when you see that. And the ability to generate a lot of credit, as you said, is linked with the massive presence of public sector. Now, there is a long debate, of course, aggressively pushed by the IMF type studies about the desperate need to privatize, but also on the Chinese side themselves taking up privatizations in the late 90s to an extent. Also, that tanked out. I found the small discussions in your book a bit inadequate. I mean, I know it didn't go deep into that, but given you have written about sustainable state, because I think much of that public debt is taken up by those public sectors. And if you think on one hand that the state responsibility has been very critical, and then on the other hand, you start bashing the public sector for taking up debts, I think that's a lack of understanding, because the public sector is accumulating debt to do some of the redistributive roles at a time when China has become so unequal, which if advocates come and say that, look, the debt in the corporate public sector is a problem, and given the problems of corruption and inefficiency, you have to privatize. I think that's a very dangerous thing. Now, I must make it clear that as a leftist, I'm not among those who said that public sector is all good and private sector is bad, and China is the prime example of saying that that's a wrong thinking. But I'm also a strong believer that the strategic presence of the public sector, whether it's in the productive sector, whether it's in areas like health and education, is extremely important to keep that balance, or else the state would fall apart or it would be cannibalized by the private sector. So I'm curious if you could elaborate more about your thoughts on the presence of the public sectors within China, the
You
state-owned
mean,
enterprises and the hybrid sectors.
yeah, the book does refer, as you know, to that one of the weaknesses confronting the government at the moment in terms of the economics is the state-owned enterprise sort of corporate debt, right? It's not household, it's corporate debt. And how would China deal with it? I cannot claim, and I don't think many people know, to be honest, the details of how the Chinese sort of debt structure at the central government and at the provincial level government is being dealt with. But I do think that this is, as you said, problematic if they don't address it. I think it's state-owned 61% of GDP or some 60% or something like that GDP. So it's quite high. You'll probably be able to correct me if that is an acceptable level or that is in fact quite a high level. So I think your question is how are they going to deal with it, or whether that is actually part of the mechanism where the center and the provinces essentially carry that debt, and then in order to facilitate the building of the necessary infrastructure. Now, I don't have the answer to how that is going to play out. What I do know from speaking to some Chinese economists is that the Chinese again my observations on the ground is that it is not seen as a serious problem, but it is seen as something that they can manage, and that over time where the source of the debt, where the spending was, etc., will sort of pay back economically. And this is where I think the Chinese sort of long-term planning, long-term view of bearing certain pain in certain areas over a period of time is a very different area, because the political calculus is not 4 years, 5 years, but I mean, the American one, everyone just kicks it down the road for year after year. So the Chinese economists I've spoken to have said that it is not serious enough that they feel that they need to essentially bring out the big artillery in terms of policy mechanisms to handle it. And I'm actually as curious as you to how this plays out and to see where the next policy adjustments will take place. But from what I see in the ground, the spending is still there, and there is some very good description how this works by my good friend Edward Sir, who used to be the former chairman of BCG, but now runs his own consulting firm in China, where he talks about how the mechanism between the state and the province in terms of the execution, the distribution, and what the state does and what the province must do, and then how the private enterprise executes as the state at the provincial level as well. So it's not all top down; it's delegated, and then the state and then province takes on certain debts, but it is linked to their own fiscal and monetary policies at the provincial level. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Yeah, no,
but
that's I guess the debt structure is very important insofar as any discussion about debt in China is concerned. That household debt is not a problem, is important to state. Of course, it has risen because of financial liberalization, segments of the population owning corporate debt, and the rise of the corporate debt. A large chunk of it is, again, public sector, which I think was my key point, which is it needs qualification, because when one does a lot of brouhaha about this corporate debt, and much of that is state-owned enterprises, then the road that you go is privatization, because these are inefficient and so on and so forth. But that's a mirage, I would say, which doesn't mean that strategic sectors cannot be privatized. But to speak of this privatization at an aggregate level is a dangerous path to do. Now, beyond that, one can definitely discuss the debt of some of the local governments, how much of them is sustainable, because a large chunk of the state-owned debt is linked to the local government's assets, and that became liability eventually as real estate prices went down. And of course, they own land, and that gives it sort of stability to finance a lot more of debt than local governments, let's say in India, which don't own land and assets. And I concede that some of those unsustainable levels have reached among certain poorer local governments. But yes, all I was stating here is that at some parts of your book, I found that there was this uncritical reputation of the word of this phrase of unsustainable debt, and linked to coupled with this need to strategically privatize, and that was what I wanted to flag here.
Fair point. I think you will appreciate that that is an exploration, perhaps a book for somebody else to write. But the book, as you know, was not meant in any of the areas that it covered an in-depth analysis. So I accept that your observation was that it was perhaps if not perhaps, it was not dealt with in detail, but that was not the point of the book itself. To give people a sort of wide view about the economy, the government system, the way the cultural fabric works, and all of those things. Yeah.
My final question to you, I know you have been doing this for an hour, and I want to be respectful about your time, but just to conclude the book, and I think without that it wouldn't be complete, is to ask you one question about foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of propaganda about it, that it is expansive, that it is irresponsible, that China's Belt and Road Initiative is a debt trap, all of which is just pure trash. Yeah, I found one of those chapters. I don't exactly remember. It was chapter 5 or chapter 6. It opens up by saying that let us ask this question: what has China done to the rest of the world? And I know you have a different foreign policy chapter where you discuss Africa, Latin America, India, etc., etc. I would recommend our viewers to particularly take a look at the Africa section. That was very interesting to me. But if you could tell us in conclusion briefly about what China has done to the rest of the world, or in other words, what has China's rise meant to the rest of the world, and how should one understand Chinese foreign policy outside the conventional framework of Western media and academic narrative?
No, that's a good question that you asked, because I think the chapter you're referring to is the chapter where I talk about is China's impact on the world, and is it a force for good or not, right?
Right.
Um, and I think it was mainly to get people to look at the facts and to, again, as I said in the book, to tend to come to their own conclusions, because I'm from Southeast Asia, and things have begun to shift. But if you go back 4 or 5 years, or even a bit more, the propaganda from Western mainstream media, which is, that's, I mean, propaganda appears to be a loaded term, but that's what it is. The BBC and CNN and all of that, it's propaganda. And then if you're smart enough, you can shift through it and say, okay, this is factual and this is just, was that the Chinese were coming to take over. And, as a Southeast Asian, I remember the Vietnam War as a very young boy, and the fear we had from the BBC, the Voice of America, and all of that. That the Vietnam War was about preventing the communist Chinese from taking over the rest of Southeast Asia, the domino theory, etc. And we all believed it because we didn't have our own books and we didn't really understand much. And after all, we were under British rule for so long. If they said this was true, this was true. And so, going back 10 years ago, many of us was the propaganda was the Chinese are going to take over. Right now, I think no war has taken place in Southeast Asia triggered by Chinese intervention. It's a well-known fact that China has not dropped a bomb or dropped a bomb in any country for over 70 years. I think its last conflict was with Vietnam during during the war, and that too you can decide whether the Chinese were right or wrong. But that's books have been written about it. So the question now is, and we ask is, it's the economic power of China. I mean, there's a lot about the South China Sea, but no war has been fought. A lot of the propaganda is about the Chinese are going to take over this and that. It hasn't happened. I think the one country where there is tension is still with the Philippines. But the previous president, Duterte, was very pro-China or more balanced. And the current one, Marcos, is very much more pro-American. And so it's kind of flat out, but nothing's really happened. So my take is that and I do some advice to the Chinese foreign ministry, and my take is that the China is to be most careful about the sort of economic impacts that it has on other countries in the world because of the sheer size and its power, right? And that will create imbalances in other countries. It will create political tensions which can be exploited, etc. So it has to tread very carefully. I've said the same about Chinese economic activity in Africa, both in the east coast of Africa in terms of marine resources and on land as well. But what should be clear, I hope, and this is what we get people to try and understand. When a Chinese company does something that, all of us can agree is not good, say a mining company going into Irian Jaya or somewhere, then it's somehow seen as nasty Chinese communists coming and doing these things, rather than if Rio Tinto did this, and they have, in the area in Indonesia, etc., is seen as Rio Tinto, the bad multinational, not the Australian government. And we've seen American companies like Freeport in Indonesia and all of that. Those are companies, and they can be good and bad actors or even accidents. So that's something that I think the book tries to say, understand. But what the book tries to say is there's more in common that in China's foreign policy than with many other countries. But where it is becoming a problem is the tension with the United States in particular. And there, an objective look would make everyone understand that and particularly with the events of recent years, that the United States is sadly what we could classify a warmongering state, unfortunately. The military industrial complex, this is not a lefty argument, it's a massive industry. And if you sell ice creams, you want hot days. If you sell arms, you need wars. It's just a business model thing. So my view on China is that it is a force for good. It's, I think, very clear that it carries risk because it's so big, but it's restrained with so much provocation over the last 10 years. I think should show the world that it doesn't want war. The other reason that you asked me, what is the reason for China's economic success? And I think part of it is staying away from military excursions in far-flung places or getting enticed through provocation in war. So whilst the West, and particularly the United States, has been squandering and creating mayhem in different parts of the world, the Chinese have. So they understand the value of peace. So I think it's a force for good. And the world's largest consumer market, that's good for the world if you believe in consumption-driven economic models, which I don't necessarily believe. It's a vital source of development aid. It facilitates trade. It's become the trading anchor partner for many small countries. It's gone out of its way to do it. It provides capital for developing countries, and through the One Belt One Road scheme, it has allowed infrastructure to penetrate many countries. And in a recent podcast we did on One Belt One Road, we had a Pakistani professional economist who described the impacts of the Chinese investments in ways even people like me never understood, both in power, the rail, and all that, which most of the world's never heard of because it never enters mainstream media. And I think right now, as well, in terms of its impact on the world, and not just simply foreign policy, it's become an engine of technical and scientific research across the world, and you know that as much as I do. So I think this is the foreign policy ideas. the foreign policy of China, my understanding, observation, is a force for good, peaceful, but it must be extremely wary that its size can result in overreach, that can result in unintended consequences as well. So that's how I would see his foreign policy, but he's been very restrained, and it's also extremely clever in terms of when you look at the if you look at the tariff wars and the geopolitics result of that. I think most American experts have concluded that China won, but China is not, clapping and celebrating. It's extremely aware that there are more challenges to come, not because of the United States, but from within its own new next phase of development. What next? As certain parts of the economy slow, as we talked about debt. So in many ways, China is like any other country. It is a large country. There's more in common, the book says, than other countries in the West in particular. And China is also what we say. I say in the book, crossing the river while feeling the stones. It's new in all of this. So that would be my take on China. Or one last point I would make on Chinese foreign policy. There is this view, which is so naive and you can't explain it, that somehow the Chinese are trying to make all the other countries be like them, and that there's a China model. Well, if there is this intention, then the China model has worked for its people. So if others want to copy it, please go ahead. But as a Chinese diplomat told me, if our model is so good, why would we want to give it to others? We want to keep it to ourselves, right? But if others want to copy it, that's good. And so I think this again is the old-fashioned propaganda that they're communists, not looking at the results. The World Bank results, 800 million out of poverty. But because they are communists, whatever results they have, we can label them communists. Whatever results they've achieved should be ignored because they are about to take over the world. The evidence is very clear. The Chinese are not about to take over the world, but they will be a force to be reckoned with. And I dare say that one part of the Chinese foreign policy and the shape of geopolitics, which I should end with, is we should all recognize that it's for the first time in about 400 years that the Western world has had to confront a non-Caucasian civilization. And I feel the pain of my Western brothers and sisters, but that is no excuse to demonize another large country. And as you're Indian, Jyotish, I would say that I've said to my Indian friends, be careful, you might be next. Once you get your act together, the focus will be on you. So I think the Western world, in terms of foreign policy, needs to have wise leaders. And it hasn't had wise leaders for a long time. Wise in terms of appreciating that the old world is over and you'll have to live with others. And those others include nations with thousands of years of civilization. So we hope that the West will come up with good leaders who can come to terms with the new world.
That was so well put. I had tons of follow-ups and so on, but I would not do any of them because we have already gone for too long, and that's also a door to be left open to invite you for one more time. But one last comment on the Chinese model. An interesting thing that I have observed is that, as you would know, and most people would know, Chinese people are extremely intelligent and very well informed about most things. But one thing where they're extremely nervous about saying anything, one question is when you ask them, what can we learn from you and borrow from you? Because I, as an Indian, having much of the things underdeveloped than China, often ask my Chinese friends, what do you think we can do that you have done is correct? And that's one question where most of them are extremely nervous. They're almost like, not literally, but they're like, we don't know. I'm exaggerating, but to just put it in context that about your comment that China is not aggressively exporting its model. In fact, I would say they are they're at the far end. Probably we are better off if they would have exported some of their models. Um,
But just if I can respond, it also comes from humility. It's a cultural humility.
right,
How can we tell you, an Indian or a Malaysian, what you should learn from us? And that
absolutely.
comes, as a surprise to people like you and me, because we've been used to Western politicians telling us how to make masala chai. So we are surprised, but that comes from that. It also comes from the fact that the Chinese, I found, and this is a fact, as they were developing in the 80s, the president had a council of international advisors. I think they were called the Environment and Development Expert Council. Some of the best minds in the world met with the Chinese president every year, and that continues. And they were so open to learning from others on the basis that we have still a lot to learn from others, but very happy for others to kind of follow them. But I agree with you. I also say, and very few Chinese will say you should do this and you should do that, except for the most sort of arrogant, TV commentators, of which there are a few sort of nationalists and chauvinists, as in any other country.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. This was a fascinating conversation, and I would strongly recommend all our viewers to take a look at the book Understanding China. Thank you so much.
Jyotish, thank you for your time and having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.